The flash of neon orange paper tucked under my windshield wiper made my blood pressure spike before I even read the words. I had been running my vegetable stand at the end of my driveway in Willow Creek Estates for exactly 3 weeks, selling tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers from my backyard garden. And apparently someone had a problem with it. The citation, printed on official HOA letterhead with an obnoxious clip art gavel in the corner, informed me that I was in violation of Section 12.4 of the Community Bylaws regarding unauthorized commercial activities, and that I owed a fine of $250 within 14 days. I stood there in my driveway on that humid Tuesday morning in mid-July, sweat already beading on my forehead even though it was barely 9 o'clock, reading the notice 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Brenda Morrison, Vice President of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I had never met this woman, never even heard her name mentioned in the 8 months since I had bought my house in this subdivision outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Cameron Hughes, and I am a 34-year-old software developer who works from home. When I purchased this modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Grove Drive, I was excited about the quarter-acre lot that came with it, specifically because of the sunny backyard that I knew would be perfect for growing vegetables. Gardening was something my grandfather had taught me when I was a kid, and after years of apartment living in downtown Charlotte, I was eager to get my hands dirty again. The garden had exceeded my expectations. By late June, I was harvesting more tomatoes, cucumbers, bell peppers, and zucchini than I could possibly eat or give away to friends. That's when I got the idea to set up a small stand at the end of my driveway. I did my research first, of course. I went to the Mecklenburg County Permitting Office and asked what I needed to do to legally sell produce. The woman at the counter, a friendly middle-aged clerk named Patricia, had walked me through the process. I filled out the application for a temporary vendor permit, paid the $40 fee, and received my official permit 3 days later in the mail. The permit was good for 6 months and allowed me to sell fresh produce from my residential property between the hours of 8 in the morning and 7 in the evening. I had the document laminated and posted it prominently on my stand, a simple wooden table I had built myself with a green and white striped umbrella to provide shade. I kept my prices reasonable, often cheaper than what people would pay at the grocery store, and I was always careful to keep my display neat and my driveway clear of any obstructions. The neighborhood seemed to appreciate it. I had regular customers, mostly retired folks and young mothers who would stop by in the morning to pick up fresh vegetables. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down came by every Thursday like clockwork to buy tomatoes for her famous sauce. The Hendersons, a couple in their 70s who lived across the street, were frequent visitors. Even some people from outside the neighborhood had started stopping by after seeing my hand-painted sign at the entrance to the street. I went inside my house, the citation still clutched in my hand, and immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer. I had received a thick packet of documents when I closed on the house, but I'll admit I had only skimmed through them at the time. Now, I read Section 12.4 carefully. It stated that residents were prohibited from operating commercial businesses from their homes that would create excessive traffic, noise, or visual disturbances, or that would alter the residential character of the neighborhood. There was a specific mention of no retail storefronts, no client meetings exceeding a certain number per week, and no external signage beyond a small professional plaque. I sat back in my chair and considered the situation. My vegetable stand was not a business in the traditional sense. I was not running a company. I did not have business insurance. I was not advertising beyond a simple sign, and I was not creating any sort of disturbance. The traffic amounted to maybe 10 to 15 customers per day, most of whom were already residents of the neighborhood. More importantly, I had a legal permit from the county that explicitly authorized what I was doing. I decided to call the number listed on the citation. A woman answered on the third ring with a clipped, efficient tone. Willow Creek Estates HOA, this is Brenda Morrison speaking. Hello, Miss Morrison. My name is Cameron Hughes. I live at 842 Maple Grove Drive, and I just received a citation from you regarding my vegetable stand. Oh yes, Mr. Hughes. Her voice took on a condescending quality that immediately set my teeth on edge. I personally inspected your property yesterday evening. You are clearly operating an unauthorized commercial enterprise in violation of our community standards. I understand your concern, I said, keeping my voice level and professional, but I have a vendor permit issued by Mecklenburg County that authorizes me to sell produce from my property. I made sure to obtain the proper legal documentation before I started. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Hughes, the county permit is irrelevant. The HOA bylaws supersede county regulations when it comes to the aesthetic and operational standards of our community. The fine stands. You have 14 days to pay, and I expect you to dismantle your stand immediately. I don't think that's how it works legally, I said, my frustration starting to show. County permits don't just get overridden by HOA rules. Mr. Hughes, I have been vice president of this HOA for 7 years. I know exactly how it works. If you refuse to comply, the fines will continue to accumulate at $250 per week, and we can place a lien on your property. I suggest you take this seriously. Her tone was patronizing, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. I would like to attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss this, I said. The next scheduled meeting is not until September, she replied curtly. This matter does not require board discussion. I have the authority to issue citations for clear violations. Good day, Mr. Hughes. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, anger and disbelief churning in my stomach. I had done everything right, followed all the legal procedures, and now this woman was threatening to fine me into submission based on her interpretation of HOA rules that I was not even sure applied to my situation. I spent the rest of that morning researching. I read articles about HOA enforcement powers, looked up North Carolina state laws regarding homeowner associations, and even posted on a legal advice forum online. The consensus seemed to be that HOAs did have significant power to enforce their bylaws, but that power was not unlimited, especially when it conflicted with legal permits issued by governmental authorities. Several people suggested I consult with a real estate attorney. I did not want to spend money on a lawyer over a vegetable stand, but I also was not about to be bullied into paying a bogus fine or shutting down something I had every legal right to do. I decided my next step would be to speak with my neighbors and see if anyone else had issues with Brenda Morrison or the HOA in general. That afternoon, I walked across the street to visit the Hendersons. Frank Henderson answered the door, a tall man with a shock of white hair and a friendly smile. Cameron, good to see you. What brings you by? Hey, Frank, I wanted to ask you something about the HOA. Have you had any interactions with Brenda Morrison? Frank's smile faded slightly. Ah, Brenda. Yes, we have had our share of encounters with her. Come on in. Margaret will want to hear this too. I followed him into their cozy living room where Margaret was reading a book in an armchair by the window. She looked up and greeted me warmly. Frank explained why I was there, and I showed them the citation. Margaret's face tightened as she read it. "That woman is a menace. Last year she tried to fine us because our mailbox post needed repainting. She claimed it was an eyesore. Frank repainted it the next day just to avoid the hassle, but the whole thing left a bad taste in our mouths. She cited the Johnsons down the street for having their trash cans visible from the road," Frank added. "Never mind that everyone's trash cans are visible on pickup day. She seems to selectively enforce rules based on her personal whims." "Has anyone ever challenged her?" I asked. "A few people have tried," Margaret said. "The problem is that she has the full backing of the HOA president, Richard Kellerman. He is barely involved, lets Brenda run everything. Most people just pay the small fines and move on because fighting it seems like too much trouble." "Well, I am not paying," I said firmly. "I have a legal county permit. She cannot just ignore that." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good for you. If you need any support, let us know. A lot of people in this neighborhood are tired of her power trips." I thanked them and spent the next few hours walking around the neighborhood, talking to other residents. The picture that emerged was consistent. Brenda Morrison was widely disliked, known for her nitpicking enforcement of minor violations while ignoring more significant issues, and had created an atmosphere of anxiety among homeowners who never knew when they might receive one of her neon orange citations. Mrs. Chen told me that Brenda had once tried to fine her for planting bamboo in her backyard, claiming it was an invasive species, even though it was a clumping variety that posed no risk to other properties. The Patel family, who had moved in 3 months ago, had been cited for their children's basketball hoop being 2 inches taller than the regulation height specified in the bylaws. By the time evening rolled around, I had spoken with nearly a dozen households, and every single one had a story about Brenda's overreach. More importantly, many of them told me they loved my vegetable stand and hoped I would keep it open. Several mentioned that it added character to the neighborhood and provided a convenient source of fresh, local produce. That night, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. I explained my position clearly and methodically. I detailed the county permit I had obtained, included a copy of the permit itself, and cited the specific North Carolina state statutes that I believed supported my right to operate the stand. I pointed out that my activities created minimal impact on the neighborhood and were actually appreciated by many residents. I requested that the citation be withdrawn and that I be allowed to continue operating with my legal permit. I sent the letter via certified mail the next morning, addressed to both Brenda Morrison and Richard Kellerman. While I waited for a response, I kept my vegetable stand open. I was not going to be intimidated into shutting down when I had done nothing wrong. 3 days later, I received another citation. This one was for $500, claiming I had defied a direct order from the HOA and that my continued operation constituted a willful violation warranting increased penalties. There was also a formal notice that if I did not cease operations immediately, the HOA would pursue legal action to obtain an injunction. That was when I decided I needed professional help. I contacted a real estate attorney named David Lawson, who had good reviews online and specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Charlotte, in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city skyline. David himself was a man in his early 50s, with graying temples and a calm, measured demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I explained the entire situation to him, showing him the citations, my county permit, the HOA bylaws, and the letter I had sent. He reviewed everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This is actually pretty straightforward," he said finally. North Carolina state law is clear that HOAs cannot prohibit activities that are explicitly permitted by governmental authorities, unless those activities violate specific, reasonable restrictions related to health, safety, or welfare. A vegetable stand operating under a valid county permit does not fall into any of those categories. "So she cannot fine me?" I asked. "She can try, but the fines are not enforceable. More importantly, if she attempts to place a lien on your property or take any other legal action, we can countersue for harassment and abuse of process." HOAs have broad authority, but that authority is not unlimited, and courts do not look kindly on board members who abuse their positions. "What do you recommend I do?" David leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "I will draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA, making it clear that their citations are legally baseless and that any further harassment will result in legal action. I will also demand that they withdraw the fines and issue a written apology. If they do not comply, we can file a lawsuit. Given the facts of your case, I am confident we would prevail." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, though I was already committed to seeing this through. "My initial retainer is $1,500. If this goes to litigation, it could cost more, but based on what I am seeing, I doubt it will get that far. Most HOAs back down quickly once they realize they do not have legal standing." I agreed to his terms and signed the retainer agreement that afternoon. David had the cease and desist letter drafted and sent by the end of the business day. It was a masterfully written document that methodically dismantled every argument in the HOA's citations and made it abundantly clear that I had the law on my side. I felt a sense of relief after leaving David's office. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was not fighting alone. I continued operating my vegetable stand, and the neighborhood support only seemed to grow. Word had spread about my dispute with Brenda Morrison, and several residents made a point of stopping by to purchase vegetables as a show of solidarity. A week after David sent the cease and desist letter, I received a phone call from Richard Kellerman, the HOA president. He had a smooth, diplomatic voice that was probably effective in boardrooms, but came across as insincere in this context. "Mr. Hughes, I received the letter from your attorney. I think there may have been some miscommunication here. Brenda was simply trying to enforce our community standards. Perhaps we can work out a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" I asked, already wary. "Well, maybe you could operate your stand only 2 days a week instead of daily, and perhaps move it to a less visible location on your property. We just want to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Mr. Kellerman, with all due respect, I have a legal county permit that allows me to operate daily from my current location. I am not violating any HOA bylaws because the bylaws cannot override county permits. My attorney has made that very clear." "I understand your position," he said, his tone becoming slightly tense. "But you need to understand ours as well. We have a responsibility to all residents, and some have complained about the appearance of your stand." "Who has complained?" I challenged. "Because I have spoken with dozens of neighbors, and they all support what I am doing. The only person who seems to have a problem is Brenda Morrison." There was a long pause. "Mr. Hughes, I am trying to avoid an escalation here. Legal disputes are expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. Then withdraw the fines and leave me alone," I said flatly. "I am not doing anything wrong and I am not backing down." He sighed heavily. "I will discuss this with the board, but I cannot make any promises." The conversation ended there, and I heard nothing for another 2 weeks. During that time, my vegetable stand continued to thrive. The summer heat was producing an abundant harvest, and I was selling more produce than ever. I had even started taking special orders from some customers who wanted specific quantities for canning or preserving. Then, on a Thursday morning in early August, I found Brenda Morrison herself standing at the end of my driveway, staring at my vegetable stand with her arms crossed and a look of pure disdain on her face. She was exactly what I had imagined. A woman in her mid-50s with a severe haircut, wearing pressed khaki capris and a polo shirt with the Willow Creek Estates logo embroidered on the chest. Her entire posture radiated self-righteous indignation. I walked down the driveway to meet her. "Can I help you with something?" She turned to face me, her expression cold. "You are Cameron Hughes, I presume?" "That's right." "I am Brenda Morrison. I think you know who I am. Mr. Hughes, you are making a mockery of our community standards. This tacky little stand of yours is an embarrassment to the entire neighborhood." "It's not tacky, and it is not an embarrassment," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger. "It is a legal vendor operation with a proper county permit. Multiple neighbors have told me they appreciate it. I do not care what a few neighbors say. I care about maintaining property values and ensuring this neighborhood remains a desirable place to live. Your little farm stand makes us look like a rural backwater. That's your opinion. It's not supported by any legal standard or community consensus." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you are clever, hiring a lawyer and throwing around legal terms, but you do not understand how HOAs work. We have ways of making life difficult for problem residents. Your fines are going to continue accumulating, and eventually, we will foreclose on your property. Then you will wish you had just complied from the beginning." "Are you seriously threatening me right now?" I said, pulling out my phone. "Because I am recording this conversation, and what you just described could constitute harassment and possibly extortion." I was not actually recording, but she did not know that, and the bluff worked. Her face flushed red. "You cannot record me without my permission." "Actually, North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I can absolutely record this conversation. Now, I suggest you leave my property before I call the police and report you for trespassing and harassment." She stood there for a moment, clearly trying to decide how to respond. Finally, she spun on her heel and marched back to her silver Mercedes SUV parked down the street. She peeled away from the curb with more speed than was safe for a residential neighborhood. My hands were shaking as I put my phone back in my pocket. The confrontation had been more intense than I had expected, and her threat about foreclosure, even though I knew it was legally baseless, had rattled me. I called David Lawson as soon as I got back inside. "She threatened you with foreclosure." David's calm voice took on an edge of steel. "That is absolutely actionable. I am going to draft an emergency motion to the court for a restraining order against her and the HOA from taking any further action against you. We are also going to file a formal complaint with the North Carolina HOA Regulatory Board. What she is doing crosses the line from aggressive enforcement into harassment and abuse of power." "Will that actually stop her?" I asked. "It will put her on notice that her actions are being scrutinized. Judges do not look kindly on HOA board members who make threats like that." "We are also going to send a letter to all the other board members, informing them that Brenda's actions are exposing the HOA to significant legal liability. That should get their attention." David moved quickly. Within 48 hours, he had filed multiple legal documents and sent letters to every member of the HOA board. He also sent a copy of everything to the HOA's attorney, a firm in Charlotte that represented several subdivisions in the area. The response was swift and came from an unexpected source. On Monday morning, I received a phone call from a woman named Susan Garcia, who identified herself as the HOA's legal counsel. "Mr. Hughes, I have reviewed the documentation your attorney filed, and I have also reviewed your case from the beginning. I need to be frank with you. The HOA does not have legal grounds to fine you or restrict your vegetable stand operation. Your county permit is valid, and you are operating within its parameters. The citations issued by Miss Morrison were not properly vetted through our office, and they should not have been issued." I was surprised by her candor. "So, what happens now?" "I am recommending to the HOA board that they withdraw all fines, issue a formal apology, and cease any further action against you. I am also recommending that Miss Morrison undergo additional training on the proper procedures for enforcement actions. However, I need to inform you that Miss Morrison is resisting this recommendation. She believes very strongly that she is in the right." "That is not my problem," I said. "She has been harassing me for weeks over something I have every legal right to do. I understand, and I agree with you. I just wanted to give you a heads up that this may not be resolved as quickly as we would like. Miss Morrison has considerable influence with the board president, and she is fighting to maintain her position." Over the next several days, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that there was turmoil within the HOA board. Several board members were apparently angry that they had not been consulted before Brenda started issuing citations to me, and they were concerned about the potential legal liability. There was talk of calling an emergency board meeting. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in mid-August, and it was open to all residents. David Lawson advised me to attend, and he accompanied me. The meeting was held in the clubhouse at the neighborhood's small community center, a single-story building near the entrance to the subdivision. When we arrived, the parking lot was already full, and there were at least 60 people crammed into the meeting room. I recognized many of my neighbors, including the Hendersons, Mrs. Chen, and the Patels. The atmosphere was tense, with small groups of people talking in hushed, animated voices. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Richard Kellerman was in the center, flanked by Brenda Morrison on one side and 3 other board members on the other side. Brenda's face was set in a rigid mask of displeasure. She did not look at me as I took a seat in the second row. Richard called the meeting to order and explained that they were there to discuss the dispute between the HOA and myself. He gave a brief, sanitized summary of the situation, framing it as a simple disagreement over interpretation of the bylaws. David stood up before Richard could continue. "Mr. Kellerman, if I may, I am David Lawson, attorney for Mr. Hughes. I think it is important that everyone here understands the facts of this case. My client obtained a valid vendor permit from Mecklenburg County before operating his vegetable stand. That permit explicitly authorizes what he is doing. Miss Morrison issued citations and fines without any legal basis, and despite being informed of the county permit. She then threatened my client with foreclosure, which constitutes harassment. This is not a simple disagreement. This is an abuse of power." A murmur ran through the room. Brenda shot to her feet. "That is a complete mischaracterization. I was enforcing our community bylaws, which exist to protect everyone's property values." "By threatening an illegal foreclosure," David replied calmly. "There are witnesses to that threat, Miss Morrison." "I never said anything about foreclosure," she protested, but her face was flushed and her voice had risen to a near shout. "You told my client that the HOA would foreclose on his property if he did not comply," David said, pulling out a written statement. "I have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Hughes detailing your exact words." Richard raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's everyone calm down. Miss Morrison, did you or did you not make statements about foreclosure?" Brenda hesitated, clearly realizing she had backed herself into a corner. "I may have mentioned that continued violation of HOA rules could eventually lead to a lien, which is standard procedure." "That is not what you said," I spoke up from my seat. "You said the HOA would foreclose on my property to make me wish I had complied. Those were your words." Several people in the audience began talking at once. One of the other board members, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Brenda, this is serious. If you made threats like that, you have exposed the HOA to significant liability." "I was doing my job," Brenda snapped, "and I resent the implication that I have done anything wrong. This man is operating a business in violation of our bylaws, and none of you seem to care." "He has a county permit," someone shouted from the back of the room. It was Frank Henderson. "The permit gives him the right to do what he is doing." "The bylaws supersede county permits," Brenda shot back. "No, they do not." This came from Susan Garcia, the HOA's attorney, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. She stood up and addressed the room. "I have researched this thoroughly. In North Carolina, HOA bylaws cannot prohibit activities that are explicitly permitted by governmental entities unless there is a compelling health, safety, or welfare concern. There is no such concern here. Mr. Hughes's vegetable stand is legal, and the HOA has no grounds to fine him or restrict his operation." The room erupted into chaos. Multiple people were shouting, some in support of me, others defending Brenda. Richard was banging a gavel, trying to restore order. Brenda's face had gone from red to almost purple, and she was yelling something about the attorney being incompetent. Finally, Richard managed to quiet everyone down. "Miss Garcia, you are saying definitively that the HOA cannot enforce any restrictions on Mr. Hughes's vegetable stand?" "That is correct. The citations should be withdrawn, the fines should be canceled, and the HOA should issue an apology to Mr. Hughes. Anything less will result in the HOA losing a lawsuit and potentially facing additional penalties for harassment." One of the other board members, a woman in her 40s, spoke up. "I move that we follow Miss Garcia's recommendation." "I second the motion," said the man with glasses. Richard looked uncomfortable. "All in favor?" 3 hands went up immediately, the 3 board members other than Richard and Brenda. Richard hesitated, then slowly raised his hand. "Motion passes 4-1. The citations against Mr. Hughes are withdrawn, the fines are canceled, and we will issue a written apology." "This is absurd," Brenda shouted. "You are all cowards. You are letting this man make a mockery of everything we have built here." "Brenda, please sit down," Richard said wearily. "I will not sit down. I have given 7 years of my life to this HOA, maintaining standards, protecting property values, and this is how you repay me. By siding with some upstart who wants to turn our neighborhood into a farmer's market." "Miss Morrison," Susan Garcia said firmly, "you need to understand that your actions have put the HOA at legal risk. If you continue down this path, you could be held personally liable for damages." "I do not care." Brenda was beyond reason now, her voice shrill. "I am right and all of you are wrong. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without proper enforcement." Richard stood up. "Brenda, I think it is best if you step down from your position as vice president, effective immediately." The room went silent. Brenda stared at Richard with an expression of utter betrayal. "You cannot do that. The board can vote to remove any officer for conduct detrimental to the HOA. Given what has happened here, I think that applies. All in favor of removing Brenda Morrison from her position as vice president? 4 hands went up, including Richard's. Brenda stood there for a long moment, trembling with rage. Then she grabbed her purse from the table, knocked over her chair, and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her with a thunderous bang. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with various residents expressing their opinions about what had happened. The consensus seemed to be relief that the matter was resolved and that I could continue operating my vegetable stand. Several people came up to me afterward to offer their support and congratulations. As I was leaving the meeting with David, Richard Kellerman approached me. He looked exhausted. "Mr. Hughes, I want to apologize personally for what you have been through. Brenda's enforcement actions have been a problem for some time, but this situation finally brought things to a head. We should have reined her in much sooner." "I appreciate that," I said. "I hope the HOA will be more careful about enforcement procedures going forward." "We will. I can promise you that. We are going to implement new policies requiring board approval for any citations, and we are going to review all of our bylaws to make sure they are clear and legally sound." I shook his hand and left with David. In the parking lot, my attorney smiled at me. "That went better than I expected. You are officially in the clear." "I cannot believe she acted like that," I said. "It was like watching a meltdown. People like Brenda Morrison often have a hard time accepting when they are wrong. She built her identity around being the enforcer of rules, and when that was taken away, she did not know how to cope. You are not going to have any more problems from the HOA." He was right. I received a formal letter from the HOA 3 days later, apologizing for the improper citations and confirming that all fines had been canceled. The letter also stated that new procedures had been implemented to ensure that enforcement actions were properly vetted before being issued. My vegetable stand continued to operate successfully for the rest of the summer. The neighborhood support was stronger than ever, with many residents making a point of stopping by regularly. I even started getting customers from other nearby subdivisions who had heard about my high-quality produce and reasonable prices. But the story did not end there. About 2 weeks after the board meeting, on a Saturday morning in late August, I was at my stand helping Mrs. Chen select tomatoes when a Mecklenburg County Sheriff's deputy pulled up in his patrol car. My heart sank for a moment, wondering if somehow Brenda had found a way to cause more trouble. The deputy got out and walked over with a friendly smile. "Are you Cameron Hughes?" "Yes, sir." "Is there a problem?" "No problem at all. I am Deputy Martinez. I have been hearing about your vegetable stand from some folks, and I wanted to stop by and grab some tomatoes if you have any left." I relaxed and smiled. "Absolutely. I have plenty. These Cherokee purples are particularly good right now." As he was picking out tomatoes, he mentioned casually, "You might want to be aware that we have had some calls about suspicious activity in this neighborhood lately. Someone has been going around taking photos of people's houses and properties, particularly at night." "Really? That is concerning." "Yeah, we have had 3 different residents call it in over the past week. We have increased patrols in the area. If you see anything suspicious, give us a call." He purchased his tomatoes and left, but his words stuck with me. Later that afternoon, I mentioned the suspicious activity to Frank Henderson when he stopped by. Frank's expression turned serious. "Actually, Margaret noticed someone taking photos of houses 3 nights ago. She thought it was odd but did not think much of it at the time. The person was in a silver SUV." A silver SUV. Brenda Morrison drove a silver Mercedes SUV. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Frank, I think we should call the police if it happens again." Can you ask Margaret to call immediately if she sees anything? Of course. You think it might be related to your HOA situation. I do not know, but the timing is suspicious. That night, I could not shake the uneasy feeling. I kept thinking about Brenda's rage at the board meeting, her sense of betrayal, and her inability to accept that she was wrong. People like that sometimes did irrational things. Around 11 o'clock, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a car engine idling outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw a silver SUV parked across the street with its headlights off. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, and I could see the faint glow of a phone screen. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She told me a deputy was in the area and would be there shortly. I stayed at the window, watching the SUV. About 3 minutes later, a patrol car turned onto my street with its lights off. It pulled up behind the silver SUV quickly, and the patrol car's lights suddenly flared to life, illuminating the night with red and blue strobes. I could not hear what was being said, but I saw the driver of the SUV get out, and even from a distance, I recognized Brenda Morrison. She was gesturing animatedly, clearly agitated. Another patrol car arrived within a minute, and a second deputy got out. The conversation went on for about 10 minutes. At one point, one of the deputies walked over to my house and rang the doorbell. I went downstairs and opened the door. "Mr. Hughes, I am Deputy Chen. We have the driver of that SUV in custody. She says her name is Brenda Morrison and that she lives in this neighborhood. She claims she was just out for a drive and stopped to make a phone call. But we found a camera with a telephoto lens in her vehicle, and the photos on the camera are all of houses in this neighborhood, including yours. Multiple shots of your house from different angles and several close-ups of your vegetable stand. You know this woman." I explained the entire situation with the HOA dispute. Deputy Chen's expression grew more serious as I talked. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. She was extremely hostile when we approached her vehicle, which is what raised our suspicions in the first place. Taking photos of someone's house repeatedly, especially at night, could constitute stalking behavior, particularly given the history you have described. We are going to bring her in for questioning." "Is that really necessary?" I asked, despite everything, not wanting to see this escalate further. "Mr. Hughes, this woman threatened you, lost her position because of her actions toward you, and is now conducting surveillance on your property at night. That is a pattern of behavior that we take seriously. At a minimum, we need to document this and make sure she understands that this kind of conduct is not acceptable." I watched as Brenda was placed in handcuffs and put into the back of a patrol car. Even from my doorway, I could hear her shouting about how this was all a misunderstanding and that she was being persecuted. The deputies remained professional but firm. Deputy Chen handed me a card. "We will be in touch if we need any additional information from you. In the meantime, if she attempts to contact you or comes near your property again, call us immediately." After the patrol cars left, several of my neighbors came outside, drawn by the commotion. I spent the next hour explaining what had happened. The general reaction was a mix of shock and vindication. Many people had suspected Brenda was unstable, but no one had expected it to go this far. The next morning, I received a call from David Lawson. "Cameron, I just got a very interesting phone call from the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's office. They are considering charging Brenda Morrison with stalking based on last night's incident and the documentation of her prior threats against you. They wanted to know if you would be willing to press charges." I thought about it carefully. Part of me wanted to just let it go and move on, but another part of me knew that Brenda's behavior had crossed a serious line. If she was willing to conduct surveillance on my house at night, what else might she do? "What do you recommend?" I asked. "I think you should cooperate with the investigation. Stalking is a serious charge and her behavior meets the legal definition. She made threats, she was removed from her position, and then she engaged in surveillance of your property. That shows a pattern of escalating behavior. The DA would not be considering charges if they did not think there was merit to the case." "All right," I said. "I will cooperate." Over the next few weeks, I gave a formal statement to the police, provided copies of all the documentation from the HOA dispute, and answered questions from the DA's office. I learned that Brenda had been charged with misdemeanor stalking and that she had retained a criminal defense attorney. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some people felt sorry for Brenda, thinking she had just made some mistakes and was now being punished too harshly. But the majority, especially those who had been on the receiving end of her enforcement actions over the years, felt that she was finally facing consequences for her behavior. The case moved slowly through the legal system. In late September, there was a preliminary hearing where the judge determined there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that she had simply been documenting HOA violations and that her presence in the neighborhood at night was innocent. But the DA presented evidence of her threatening statements to me, and the fact that she had been taking photos exclusively of my property and a few other homes belonging to people who had supported me at the board meeting. The judge was not sympathetic. He noted that Brenda's actions showed a clear intent to intimidate and harass, and he ordered her to stay at least 500 feet away from my property and to have no contact with me whatsoever. In early October, as my garden was winding down for the season, and my vegetable stand was operating on a reduced schedule with the last of the fall crops, Brenda's attorney approached the DA with a plea deal. Rather than go to trial, Brenda would plead guilty to a reduced charge of disorderly conduct, pay a fine, and complete anger management counseling. She would also have to write a formal apology to me and agree to a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from coming near my property. The DA called me to ask if I was comfortable with the plea deal. I thought about it for a day and then agreed. I was not interested in seeing Brenda go to jail. I just wanted her to leave me alone and to acknowledge that what she had done was wrong. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in mid-October. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom with David Lawson beside me. Brenda was there with her attorney, looking diminished and defeated in a way that was almost sad. The confidence and righteous anger that had defined her during the HOA dispute were gone, replaced by a hollow, brittle composure. The judge reviewed the terms of the plea deal and asked Brenda if she understood and accepted them. She said yes in a barely audible voice. The judge then asked if she had anything to say. Brenda stood up slowly. She looked toward me for the first time, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "I want to say that I am sorry. I let my desire to maintain community standards cloud my judgment, and I acted inappropriately. I should not have threatened you, and I should not have been taking photos of your property. I was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." It felt rehearsed, probably written by her attorney, but there was also a note of genuine remorse in her voice. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words. The judge accepted the plea, imposed the fine and counseling requirements, and issued the permanent restraining order. Brenda was led out of the courtroom by her attorney, and I never saw her again. The HOA, under new leadership, sent me a formal letter in November thanking me for my patience during the dispute and inviting me to apply for a position on the board. I declined politely, explaining that I preferred to focus on my work and my garden. However, I did attend the next several board meetings to ensure that the new procedures were being implemented fairly. The new vice president was a retired teacher named Linda Walsh, a calm, reasonable woman who believed in enforcing rules sensibly and with community input. Under her leadership, the HOA became much less adversarial and more focused on actually serving the residents. My vegetable stand operated successfully through the end of October. By early November, as the weather turned colder and the garden stopped producing, I closed the stand for the season. I had made about $2,000 over the course of the summer, which more than covered the costs of seeds, supplies, and the county permit. More importantly, I had made connections with my neighbors and had become a known and respected member of the community. The Hendersons, Mrs. Chen, the Patels, and dozens of others had become friends, not just customers. The whole experience, despite the stress and conflict, had actually brought the neighborhood closer together. In December, I received a Christmas card from Richard Kellerman with a handwritten note thanking me for standing up to Brenda and helping to bring about positive change in the HOA. Several other neighbors also sent cards, many with notes expressing their appreciation for the vegetable stand and hopes that I would open it again the following summer. As the year came to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had bought a house thinking I would simply have a quiet place to live and work, maybe grow some vegetables for myself. Instead, I had ended up in a legal battle with my HOA, had been stalked by an unhinged board member, and had become an unlikely catalyst for reform in my neighborhood. On New Year's Eve, the Hendersons invited me over for dinner. It was a small gathering, just their family and a few close friends from the neighborhood. As we sat around their table, sharing food and stories, Frank raised his glass in a toast. "To Cameron," he said, "for having the courage to stand up for what was right and for bringing this neighborhood together in ways we never expected. Here is to many more years of fresh vegetables and good neighbors." Everyone clinked glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. This was what community was supposed to be about: people supporting each other, standing together against unreasonable authority, and building something positive out of conflict. When spring arrived, I began preparing my garden for another season. I expanded it slightly, adding new beds for additional crops. I also built a new, larger stand at the end of my driveway, this time with a proper roof and better signage. I made sure my county permit was renewed early and prominently displayed. On the first Saturday in May, I opened for business again. The line of customers started before I even finished setting up. Mrs. Chen was first, eager for fresh lettuce and radishes. The Hendersons came by with their grandchildren, who were visiting for the weekend. The Patels stopped by with their kids. Even Deputy Martinez, the sheriff's deputy who had bought tomatoes the previous summer, came by in his personal vehicle to see what I had available. As I stood there in the warm spring sunshine, selling fresh vegetables and chatting with neighbors, I thought about Brenda Morrison and her obsessive need to control everything. She had seen my vegetable stand as a threat to her vision of what the neighborhood should be, something that needed to be stamped out. But in reality, the stand had become something that brought people together and made the neighborhood better. Linda Walsh, the new HOA vice president, stopped by in the afternoon. She bought some herbs and complimented me on the setup. "You know," she said, "we have had 3 other residents inquire about setting up their own stands. One wants to sell homemade baked goods, another wants to sell crafts. I told them to follow the proper procedures and get the necessary permits, just like you did." "That is great," I said, genuinely pleased. The more life and activity we have in the neighborhood, the better. That is exactly what I told the board. We are shifting our focus from restriction to facilitation. Rules should serve the community, not strangle it. Throughout that summer and into the fall, my vegetable stand flourished. I added a donation jar with a sign indicating that any extra money would go to the local food bank, and customers were generous. By the end of the season, I was able to donate over $800 to help feed families in need. In September, I was invited to speak at a regional HOA conference about my experience. The organizers wanted me to share my story as a cautionary tale for HOA boards about the importance of reasonable enforcement and respect for legal permits. I agreed, and my talk was well received. Several attorneys in the audience told me afterward that they had dealt with similar cases and appreciated hearing from the homeowner's perspective. One attorney, an older woman who specialized in HOA law, pulled me aside after my talk. "You did everything right," she said. "You got the proper permits, you tried to work with the HOA, you documented everything, and you stood your ground when you were in the right. A lot of people in your situation would have just given up and paid the fines. The fact that you fought back not only protected your own rights, but probably helped a lot of other homeowners in your neighborhood who might have faced similar issues." As the second season wound down and I closed my stand for the winter, I realized that the whole experience had changed me in subtle but important ways. I was more confident, more connected to my community, and more aware of my rights and responsibilities as a homeowner. I had learned that standing up to unreasonable authority was not only possible but necessary, and that when you do it the right way with proper documentation and legal support, you can win. The following spring, I did something I had been thinking about for months. I organized a neighborhood garden club. I invited anyone who was interested in growing vegetables, flowers, or herbs to join. We would share tips, trade seeds and plants, and help each other with garden projects. The response was overwhelming. Nearly 30 residents signed up for the first meeting. The garden club became a fixture of the neighborhood. We organized workdays where we would help elderly or disabled residents maintain their gardens. We started a community composting program. We even convinced the HOA to convert an unused common area into a community garden with individual plots for residents who did not have suitable space on their own properties. Linda Walsh, the HOA vice president, was a strong supporter of the garden club. She helped us navigate the approval process for the community garden and even convinced the board to allocate funds for soil, fencing, and water access. It was a stark contrast to the adversarial relationship that had existed under Brenda Morrison's leadership. I occasionally wondered what had happened to Brenda. Through the neighborhood grapevine, I heard that she had sold her house in Willow Creek Estates and moved to another part of Charlotte. Some people said she had joined the board of her new HOA, while others said she had withdrawn from community involvement entirely. I hoped, for her sake, and for the sake of her new neighbors, that she had learned something from what had happened. My vegetable stand continued to operate every summer, becoming an anticipated seasonal tradition in the neighborhood. Children who had been toddlers when I first opened were now old enough to ride their bikes down to buy vegetables with their allowance money. The stand had been featured in a local newspaper article about urban farming, which brought even more customers from surrounding areas. On a warm July evening in my fourth summer of operation, I was closing up the stand when a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. A young couple got out, looking a bit hesitant. The man spoke first. "Are you Cameron Hughes? We just bought a house 2 neighborhoods over, and we heard about your situation with your HOA and how you fought for your right to operate this stand. We are thinking about doing something similar, maybe selling flowers from our garden, and we wanted to ask your advice." I smiled and invited them to sit down at the picnic table next to the stand. For the next hour, I walked them through everything I had learned. The importance of getting proper permits first, documenting everything, understanding their HOA bylaws, and knowing their legal rights. I gave them David Lawson's contact information and encouraged them to consult with an attorney before they started. As they were leaving, the woman turned back to me. "Thank you so much for this. A lot of people would have just kept this information to themselves." "Community is about helping each other," I said. "That is what I learned from all of this. When we support each other and stand up for what is right, good things happen." They drove away, and I finished closing up the stand as the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I stood there for a moment, looking at the neighborhood around me, thinking about how much had changed since that first neon orange citation had appeared on my windshield. What Brenda Morrison had intended as punishment, a way to shut down something she saw as a violation of her perfect vision for the neighborhood, had instead become a catalyst for positive change. The vegetable stand was still here, stronger than ever. The HOA was more reasonable and community-focused. Neighbors were more connected to each other, and I had become not just a resident but an active, engaged member of a real community. I gathered up the empty crates and folded the tablecloth, preparing to take everything back to the garage. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Chen asking if I would have more tomatoes ready by Thursday. I replied that I would and reminded her that I was also going to have fresh basil if she wanted some for her sauce. As I walked up the driveway carrying the crates, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It had not been easy. There had been stress, anger, legal fees, and genuine fear about what might happen. But in standing up for myself, in refusing to back down when I knew I was right, I had discovered something important about who I was and what I was capable of. The lights were on in several houses along the street, and I could see families gathering for dinner, kids playing in yards, people living their lives in this quiet suburban neighborhood. This was what it was all about. Not perfect lawns and rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules, but real people building real lives together, supporting each other, and creating something meaningful. I set the crates down in the garage and looked at the empty vegetable stand, already planning what I would bring out tomorrow. There were cucumbers ready to pick, a new batch of lettuce, some beautiful yellow squash. The garden was producing abundantly, and there would be plenty to share. As I walked back toward my house, I saw Frank Henderson out checking his mail. He waved and I waved back. "Good sales today," he called. "Great sales," I replied. "Sold out of tomatoes again." "Save me some for next week," he said with a laugh. "Margaret is already planning her canning." "Will do." I went inside, made myself dinner, and sat down at my computer to catch up on some work. But my mind kept drifting back to the stand, to the customers, to the connections that had formed. What had started as a simple idea to sell extra vegetables had become so much more. It had become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny, a gathering place for the community, and a reminder that ordinary people could stand up to authority and win. The legal battle was over. Brenda Morrison was gone. The fines had been canceled. The HOA had reformed its practices. But the impact of what had happened continued to ripple outward. Other neighborhoods were hearing the story and rethinking their own enforcement practices. Homeowners who had been afraid to challenge unfair citations were finding the courage to stand up. And people like that young couple who had visited me tonight were learning that they had rights and that those rights were worth defending. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I received an email from David Lawson. He had forwarded me an article from a state legal journal about HOA reform in North Carolina. My case was mentioned as an example of how homeowners could successfully challenge HOA overreach. David had added a note. Thought you would want to see this. Your case is becoming something of a landmark. Well done. I read the article with a mixture of pride and disbelief. A landmark case, all because I had wanted to sell some tomatoes from my driveway. It was surreal to think that my stubborn refusal to pay an unjust fine had led to this, to actual change in how HOAs operated, to other people being helped. The seasons continued to turn. Another winter came and went. My garden club continued to grow and flourish. The community garden plots were all claimed and bursting with produce. And when spring arrived again, my vegetable stand opened right on schedule, the county permit proudly displayed, a symbol of what happens when you stand up for what is right and refuse to be bullied into submission. The neighborhood that Brenda Morrison had tried so hard to control with her rigid enforcement and petty citations had become something better than she could have imagined. It had become a real community, one built not on fear of violations and fines but on mutual support, shared interests, and the simple pleasure of fresh vegetables on a summer morning. And I had played a part in making that happen, not through any grand plan or special wisdom, but simply by refusing to back down when I knew I was right, and by having the courage to fight for my small piece of the American dream. A house, a garden, and the freedom to share the fruits of my labor with my neighbors.